Gamal Abdel Nasser was born in 1918 in Alexandria, Egypt. His father was Abdel Nasser, who worked in a post office. His mother was Fahima Hamad, who died during childbirth when Gamal was 8. He has two brothers. He's Muslim. Gamal attended school in Cairo in his early adolescence, and he lived with his uncle who lived in Cairo. In 1937, he joined the Royal Military Academy, and then in 1938, he graduated from the Royal Military Academy and joined the Egyptian Army. He sent through the ranks and became an officer. A turning point in Gamal's early life was in 1942 when a very pro-British government was put in, and they were very corrupt and not very nice to the Egyptians, and not a lot of people liked them. They were led by Nahash Pasha, who was a very pro-British person, and the Egyptians did not take well to him. Gamal has always been very anti-British, even in his early years. In his early teens, he was often involved in demonstrations and riots that were very anti-British. He was, in fact, even hurt in a demonstration in his early teens in a clash with British troops. Before ruling, the 1948 War. The 1948 War was a war between four Arab nations and Israel. Haganah, an Israeli extremist terrorist group, attacked Palestine Arabs in what would be modern-day Israel. The Arab community in the Middle East did not take well to this, and after World War II, when Israel became a country, they attacked Israel immediately in retribution for the attacks on the Palestine Arabs. 4 countries attacked Israel. Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria attacked in retribution. They attacked on separate fronts and at separate times, which made their attack in the 1948 war not very useful. If they would have attacked in unison and attacked Israel all at once, they would have crushed the Israeli resistance. Also, Israel was very well prepared military-wise. They had experienced soldiers, they had tons of equipment, they had a large navy, a large air force, and they had better tactics. They were able to push back all the attacks on all fronts and crush the opposition. In fact, they even flexed their guns against Egypt and bombed Egypt in the late end of the 1948 war, which was very humiliating for Egypt. However, Gamal Abdel Nasser did very well in the war. As an officer leading the 157th Division, he did very well and proved very honorable, holding back the Israeli. After the 1948 war, Gamal returned to Egypt and was very disappointed with what he saw. He saw a stagnant economy that was based on agriculture, that was not moving very far, and he saw a still corrupt government influenced by the British imperialism that was present in Egypt. He sought change, so in 1949 he created the Freed Officers Movement. This movement was a conspiracy group that was bent on getting rid of the British imperialism in Egypt. They met together in secret and they planned to overthrow the British government. They created pamphlets with their manifesto on them. They wanted an end to British imperialism, they wanted the end to a corrupt government, and they wanted to build an Egyptian government and build Egypt from the ground up as a pure Egypt with no Western influence. They published all these pamphlets and they handed them out to the public and spread the word about what they wanted to do. They were planning a coup, but they didn't tell when or what or how, and they kept that a secret. They planned the coup d'etat with a very prominent Egyptian general, General Naguib. He was the leader of the coup. He was kind of in charge, along with a couple other officers, including Nasser. On July 22nd in 1952, the coup occurred. It was an almost bloodless coup with about 10 people. In the book, it said 10 people were killed, so it was almost bloodless coup. What they did was they attacked. They started the coup at night, and what they did was, since Cairo was the capital, there was a large military present. And the coup, being all military members, they mobilized the military against the government and kind of isolated Cairo. They cut off all the main roads, even the secret roads that they knew about, and they cut off people from getting in and out of the city. They cut the telephone wires, they stopped all the radio broadcasts, they stopped trains so nobody could get in or out, and there's no way that a cry for help could occur at all. And then what they did was they overthrew the government and they exiled all the royal family, including the king, getting rid of the monarchy. What they did then, the freed officers established the Revolutionary Command Council, which is almost identical to the Founding Fathers of America. They were a group that decided the political future of Egypt. They talked about it and they deliberated and they made decisions for the best of Egypt. They created a new constitution, making Egypt a republic, and then they elected General Naguib to be the ruler. However, in his first year, Naguib was not a very effective ruler. He lost the support of the public right away and the military, which is a very tough thing for him because the military got him in the position that he was. The coup was led by military, so the loss of military support, including Nasser, was a big deal. After an assassination attempt on his life, Naguib went into hiding, and Nasser unanimously just took control. He unofficially announced that he's the new prime minister and took control without telling anyone, and then he just said that I'm the prime minister and I am now in charge of Egypt. The Egyptians thought that was a little unfair, so they held a national election, and Nasser won in a landslide. So in 1954, Nasser was officially elected as the prime minister of Egypt. With a little bit of resentment after the national election, Nasser outlawed all political parties, like eliminating oppression, and he only left his political party, the National Union Party. In power, Nasser was a socialist, which means he believes in a system of governments which the government controls the means of production and the distribution of the goods. Nasser also eliminated freedom of press, so he did not allow people to speak out against him and talk downly about his ruling or what he should have done better or how he is ruling. He also created a government-controlled media, which was very pro-Nasser, promoting that he was a great ruler and all that. It was a very biased media. One of the early important works in Gamal's ruling was the 1954 Heads of State Agreement. It was a series of peaceful negotiations between the British and Egypt. It was about getting rid of British influence in Egypt. After a series of negotiations, the two decided that British influence would be withdrawn from Egypt and that British troops would also evacuate the area, including around the Suez Canal, which is important for later on. Economically, while in power, Nasser started land reform, which is a very big deal, because in 1952, before the coup in the pro-British government, 33% of the cultivated land available was controlled by 0.4% of the population. It shows that the pro-British government gave a lot of kickbacks to the people that were loyal to the government. So Nasser went in and he broke all that up, tried to move the Egyptian economy away from an agricultural base and more towards an industrialized base. He started to industrialize the economy, and that led to the rise of a social class, the F&D. The F&D was a smart and educated social class that came up through the ranks that resembled the strong middle class in countries like the United States. While in power, Nasser ruled with a tight grip on the economy and politics. With his method of economic advancement in Egypt, the phrase Egyptianization was coined, referring to the land breaking up and the industrialization. Also, while in power, there were several assassination attempts on Nasser, which were all unsuccessful. One of the biggest things that happened while Nasser was in power was the Suez Crisis. The Suez Canal, as you all know, is a strategic trade route in the Mediterranean that connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea. It is vital for trade in the Mediterranean community, especially countries like Egypt, Southern Europe, Israel, and all the bordering nations on the Mediterranean Sea. In 1956, Nasser declared that he's going to nationalize the Suez Canal. He did not tell the British, who owned part of the canal, or the French, who built the canal, who also owned it, that he's going to do this, and he sent troops in to back up his decision to nationalize the canal. This was key because in the 1954 Heads of State Agreement, the British removed the troops protecting the canal, so there was nobody to resist this change. The Middle East saw this decision and this step forward as a great step forward. They loved it. They saw it as a way of getting rid of the Western influence in the Middle East and the rise of Arab nationalism. They saw it as a change and a new era. Israel, on the other hand, with the tension between Israel and Egypt after the 1948 war, saw this as a huge, huge issue. They knew that because of the tension between the two, Egypt was going to limit the trade in which Israel's economy is heavily dependent upon. After the nationalization of the canal, Israel, France, and Britain invaded Egypt. They attacked, and Egypt's navy held their ground, but on the ground, Egypt did not defend very well. The Israeli commandos rolled over on Egypt. The UN had to intervene and stop the fighting because of all the casualties and the issues going on. But at the end of the war, After the end of the Suez Crisis, they gave the entire control of the Suez Canal to the Egyptians, which is a huge win for Gamal, because now he had sole control of the canal, which was a very profitable thing. This was very, very helpful to his industrialization of Egypt, because the canal lifted up the economy and allowed for the industrialization to occur. Large industries started popping up after the nationalization of the canal, and large banks became prominent, and it really helped Egypt become a major player in the world economically. While in rule, the United Arab Republic. A major thing that Gamal Nasser also did was the merger between Syria and Egypt. Syria and Egypt have always been close allies, partially because Syria is also kind of a communist, socialist Arab nation, and so is Egypt, so they really meshed together really well, and they became really good friends, and they traded all the time heavily. Their economy was very dependent on each other trading. The USSR had a heavy influence in Syria, which was an issue because USA had a heavy influence in Turkey, its bordering nation. And with the Cold War going on, this anti-communism and communism tension going on between the Cold War made an issue. Shots were exchanged between Syria and Turkey, which led to Egypt sending troops in. In 1957, after a series of talks and discussions for the best of the two nations, the UAR was formed, the United Arab Republic. It was a federation between Egypt and Syria, with Gamal Nasser being elected head of the parliamentary democracy. What the UAR did best was they tried to promote the image of Arab nationalism, especially on other Arab countries like Lebanon, but it didn't work because they forced it on too fast and too much, pressuring Lebanon to give in to Arab nationalism, and it didn't work. After a series, in 1961, there was a series of issues that occurred, and Syria seceded from the United Arab Republic. This was partially because of Nasser's work, with Nasser promoting Egyptian people in Syrian governmental positions instead of Syrians. He elected Egyptians to run Syria's government instead of Syrians, and that was a large issue between the two countries, and Syria seceded in 1961. The 1967 war was another major event that occurred under Nasser's rule. Syria and Egypt signed a defense pact, meaning that the two nations would back each other up in times of crisis or in war in 1964, kind of reforming the UAR, but not completely. With religious tension between Israel and Syria, Egypt sent troops in, and Israel marched troops along the border of Syria. In response to this, Egypt cut off trade for Israel, which would damage their economy, and Egypt declared that as an act of war. They attacked swiftly and fastly, dropping an airstrike right away into Egypt. The airstrike was devastating, but not completely. Egypt got wind that Israel was going to attack from the south, so they moved a bulk of their army into the south in defense on reliance of the source, but it wasn't a very accurate source because Israel attacked with all their might on the north, destroying one of the most key air bases in Egypt in the Sinai region that held a majority of their air support. It was a humiliating loss for Egypt. It was devastating. The war lasted less than a month. After the attack on Sinai, Egypt surrendered right away and began peace talks. It was humiliating for Nasser and very embarrassing. Another thing that happened during Nasser's rule was the War of Attrition. The War of Attrition was again a conflict over the Suez Canal between Egypt and Israel. Israel had never really let go that Egypt got control of the canal. And so in 1969, a strafe bombing attack by Israel was commenced on the Suez Canal. There was many casualties, and Egypt retaliated with a series of raids in Israel. It became a guerrilla warfare with a lot of on and off warfare, just periodically for 1 month and off for another month, and then again on. There was no real winner, but there was some misfire. A school in Egypt was bombed, and hundreds of innocent casualties occurred, and that kind of fueled Egypt's retaliation. There was no winner, and the war kind of ended in 1970. Gamal Abdel Nasser died on September 28, 1970. He died of a heart attack. This was a serious blow to the Egyptians because he was their prominent founding father. He was a huge figure. He did everything he did. because he loved Egypt so much and he cared about the country so much. And the Egyptians took it very hard, and it was tough for them to let him go. Gamal Abdel Nasser's legacy was the Suez Crisis and getting control of the Suez Canal. I think it was a very bold move. He had no permission to do that, but he went ahead and took it, and it built Egypt, partially economically for sure, into what it is today. And with that, the heads of state was a great diplomatic negotiation by Gamal and his government, and that was a major thing that he did. Also, Arab nationalism was very big with Gamal, and he will be remembered as one of the prominent figures of Arab nationalism in the belief of getting rid of the Western influence in the Middle East and letting them really, all the Arab nations, kind of be themselves, free from Western influence, and be who they want to be. And he was big on that movement. In ties to globalization, imperialism was a very big impact because of the British imperialism in Egypt. It led to the response by Nasser and them in overthrowing Egypt. Also, Western spheres of influence was another thing I noticed, with the Western spheres of influence in Turkey by the United States and the USSR and Syria and partially in Egypt. So I noticed that was another tie relating to globalization. The end.